It was on an unusually bright May morning that Hercule Poirot found himself seated in the elegant dining room of his flat on Whitehaven Mansions, meticulously attending to the symmetry of his breakfast tray. His boiled eggs, cooked precisely to 3.5 minutes, rested in their porcelain cups like twin golden orbs. The coffee steamed fragrantly, and Poirot permitted himself the smallest of contented sighs. "A perfect morning, is it not, Hastings?" he remarked, his moustaches twitching with approval. Captain Arthur Hastings, Poirot's faithful friend and chronicler, glanced up from his newspaper. "Quite right, Poirot. I dare say the weather might actually stay pleasant for once. Though there's a rather tragic story here. Colonel Archibald Melrose, found dead in his study at Melrose Manor. The police seem rather baffled." Poirot arched one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "A colonel, you say? And the police are baffled? Intriguing. Tell me more, mon ami." Hastings unfolded the paper, his tone dropping into a more serious cadence. "It appears Colonel Melrose was discovered in his locked study. Shot, but there's no sign of forced entry or struggle. His wife, Lady Constance Melrose, reported hearing a gunshot, but when the butler broke down the door, the colonel was dead, and the revolver was by his side. The local constabulary believes it might be suicide, but those who knew him say it's impossible. The colonel was by all accounts the most disciplined and resolute of men." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And why, Hastings, would such a disciplined man take his own life?" "No, it does not sit well with me. Discipline and self-destruction do not often reside within the same soul." Hastings looked skeptical. "But it was a locked room, Poirot. How could anyone have shot him from the outside?" A glint appeared in Poirot's eyes. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, the question is not how, but why. If there is a crime, the method will follow the motive. And as for locked rooms, there is always a way in and out. One must only find it." At that precise moment, Poirot's musings were interrupted by a brisk knock at the door. Miss Felicity Daventry, a family friend of the Melroses, entered, her face pale and anxious. "Monsieur Poirot," she began breathlessly, "you must come at once. Lady Melrose insists that it cannot be suicide. She begs your assistance. She says only you can discover the truth." Poirot rose, the keen light of excitement brightening his expression. "Mais oui, mademoiselle. You may tell Lady Melrose that Hercule Poirot shall come. Hastings, prepare yourself. We journey to Melrose Manor." As Hastings hurried to gather his hat and coat, Poirot took a moment to smooth his tie, his gaze thoughtful. A man who follows orders all his life, yet meets his end, defying the most fundamental one, to preserve oneself. This, I think, shall prove most curious indeed. The journey to Melrose Manor took just over a hour, with Hastings at the wheel of his trusty Morris Cowley, while Poirot sat contemplatively beside him, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The countryside flashed past in vibrant greens, but Poirot's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the morning's news. "Melrose Manor," Poirot mused aloud. "A grand estate, is it not, Hastings?" "Indeed, old chap," Hastings replied. Colonel Melrose was something of a war hero, decorated in the Boer War and the Great War alike. A stickler for protocol, according to the papers. Hard to imagine him taking his own life. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Discipline, mon ami, can be both armor and a prison. A man of unwavering routine and duty, such a one does not on a whim abandon life. Non, there must be more." As they turned down the long, winding drive leading to the manor, they saw the imposing stone structure appear, framed by meticulously kept gardens. A uniformed constable stood at the entrance, visibly relieved when he recognized Poirot. "Inspector Bragg's inside, sir," the man informed them, tipping his hat. "He's not best pleased, mind. Doesn't think it's anything but a clear-cut case of suicide." Poirot's lips curled slightly. "Ah, but certainty without reason is a dangerous thing. Come, Hastings, Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with subdued grief. The drawing room was filled with murmurs and the occasional sob, primarily from Lady Constance Melrose, a woman of about 50, with finely coiffed silver hair and an air of determined dignity despite her evident distress. A few other guests were scattered around: a tall, distinguished man with a severe expression, a younger woman with red-rimmed eyes, and a man of about 30, clearly trying to maintain a stoic composure. Inspector Bragg, a robust man with a ruddy complexion, approached them with a brisk nod. "Ah, Poirot, I didn't expect you here." "Lady Melrose requested my assistance," Poirot replied, his tone cordial but firm. "Tell me, mon ami, what conclusions have you drawn thus far?" Bragg sniffed. "Simple enough. Colonel Melrose, found dead in his study. Gunshot wound to the head, revolver in his hand, door locked from the inside, window bolted. No sign of a struggle. Coroner says it was instant. Likely shot himself. Mrs. Melrose insists it's impossible, but we've seen this before. Prideful men hiding their troubles until they snap." Poirot listened intently, eyes glinting. "And you found no evidence suggesting otherwise?" Bragg hesitated. "Nothing overt. Just odd details. The colonel had a letter opener in his hand when he was found, but it doesn't make sense. If he intended to shoot himself, why hold that?" "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "The mind, Inspector, often betrays itself in the smallest of details. I will examine the study. Hastings, observe, but do not touch." Bragg led them to the study, a room of dark wood, neatly organized, with an air of military precision. The desk was immaculate, save for a few documents laid out in regimented lines. The colonel's body had already been removed, but a chalk outline remained, and the scent of gunpowder lingered faintly. Poirot moved slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes sweeping the room like a hawk surveying a field. He paused by the window, noting the undisturbed latch, then at the desk, where the letter opener lay beside a sheet of paper. "Curious," he whispered. "A man about to take his life does not often draft correspondence, and yet this letter, it is unfinished." He leaned closer, reading aloud. "To my beloved Constance, I must confess to you that—" The line ended abruptly, the ink trailing as if cut short by something sudden. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "An incomplete farewell. Most peculiar." Hastings glanced over. Perhaps he changed his mind halfway through writing. Poirot shook his head. "Known, Hastings. The stroke of the pen, see how it wavers and then breaks. This suggests interruption, not indecision. And look, on the windowsill, a faint smudge of something dark." He delicately scraped the residue with a gloved fingertip. "Candle wax, I believe. But the room is bright. No candles burned recently. This suggests someone moved or disturbed a candlestick." Poirot straightened, eyes thoughtful. "Mon cher Hastings, summon Lady Melrose. I wish to speak with her." Hastings obliged, and a few minutes later, Lady Melrose entered, her composure fragile but holding. Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame, my condolences. I must ask, did your husband often write letters late at night?" Lady Melrose frowned. "Not often. Archie was a man of action, not words, but lately he seemed preoccupied, almost nervous. I thought it was his health, but he wouldn't speak of it." Poirot nodded. "And did he ever leave a letter unfinished?" "Never," she replied firmly. "He always completed any correspondence before moving on." Poirot tapped his chin. "And this wax? Did your husband have the habit of sealing his letters with a candle?" "No," Lady Melrose answered, perplexed. "He rarely used wax seals." Poirot glanced at Hastings. A sealed message, then, perhaps brought to the study. Lady Melrose, who among the guests had access to this room yesterday evening? She hesitated. "Well, Archie's old army friend, Major Harold Baines, was here. So was Beatrice, our ward, and Roland, her fiancée. They were all in the drawing room when I retired for the night. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, madame. You have been most helpful. As she left, Hastings looked puzzled. But what does it all mean, Poirot? Poirot smiled faintly. It means, my friend, that the good colonel was not alone in his final moments. Someone was with him, a person who may have interrupted that letter. The question now is not why he wrote it, but why he never finished it. The answer, Hastings, may change everything. He glanced back at the desk, where the letter opener lay, its edge gleaming in the morning light. Come, Hastings. We must speak to Major Baines and the others. The story is like a fine tapestry. One must gently pull at the right thread to see the whole pattern unravel. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on the letter opener as he straightened, his gaze sharp and calculating. He moved to the window once more, his gloved fingers lightly tracing the sill where the faint smudge of wax lingered. He murmured to himself, the wheels of his agile mind already turning. Hastings, he said suddenly, the letter opener. Do you notice anything peculiar about it? Hastings bent over the desk, squinting at the polished blade. Well, it seems rather ordinary to me. Silver, polished, perhaps a family heirloom. Poirot's eyes sparkled. Exactement, my friend. It is too polished, not a single fingerprint, not even the colonel's. A man in the act of despair, about to end his life, would hardly trouble himself to wipe the handle clean. Hastings looked startled. You think it was placed there deliberately? Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile. Perhaps, but more importantly, it suggests the presence of another, a person who might have handled it, then taken care to erase their traces. And the unfinished letter, to my beloved Constance, I must confess. What was it he sought to confess, I wonder? As if on cue, the door to the study creaked open, and a tall, severe-looking man with a bristling mustache stepped inside. His military bearing was unmistakable, his stride purposeful, yet cautious. Major Harold Baines, I presume? Poirot inquired, his eyes narrowing slightly. The major stiffened, his jaw tightening. Yes, and you must be the famous Hercule Poirot. I didn't expect to see you here. Poirot inclined his head politely. When there is a mystery, Major, one must always expect Poirot. I believe you were with the colonel on the evening of his death. Baines hesitated, his gaze flicking to the letter on the desk. Yes, I was here. We shared a drink, talked about old times as men of our age are wont to do. And did you notice anything unusual about his demeanor? Any hint that he was troubled or distressed? Baines frowned, his thick brows drawing together. No, Archie was his usual self. Perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but we all have our moments, don't we? Poirot's gaze sharpened. And you were in the drawing room when the shot was fired? The major nodded. Yes, with Lady Melrose, Beatrice and young Roland. We heard the shot and rushed to the study, but the door was locked. By the time the butler forced it open, it was too late. Poirot's head tilted slightly, his eyes never leaving the major's face. And you saw nothing out of place? No one behaving strangely? Baines hesitated, a flicker of something crossing his eyes. Well, Beatrice seemed particularly shaken. But then, she's always been a sensitive girl, easily upset. Poirot's mustaches twitched. And young Roland, how did he react? The major's jaw tightened again, a muscle in his cheek twitching. He was quiet, oddly so now that you mention it. Stood there like a statue, barely spoke a word. Merci, Major, Poirot said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. You have been most helpful. Hastings, I believe it is time we spoke with Beatrice and her fiancé. Baines' eyes flicked once more to the letter on the desk, and Poirot caught the glance, filing it away in his ever-active mind. As the major left, Poirot's fingers drummed lightly on the desk, the rhythmic tapping a sign of his intense concentration. They found Beatrice in the garden, her delicate frame hunched over a blooming rose bush, fingers trembling as she absent-mindedly plucked at the petals. She looked up at their approach, her pale face framed by dark, wind-tossed hair. "Miss Beatrice," Poirot said gently, his tone almost fatherly, "may we have a word?" She straightened, hastily brushing her hands against her skirts. "Of course, Mr. Poirot. Is it about the Colonel?" "Oui, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, his voice soft yet probing. "I understand you were present in the drawing room when the tragedy occurred." Beatrice's eyes grew wide, her lips parting in a nervous, breathless whisper. Yes, I was. We were all together, waiting for him to join us. And then we heard the shot." Poirot's gaze held hers, unblinking. "And you rushed to the study?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "But the door, it was locked. We couldn't get in. It was awful. And when the butler finally forced the door, what did you see?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting in the folds of her dress. He was slumped over his desk. The gun was still in his hand. Lady Melrose screamed, and Roland just stood there, staring. Poirot leaned in slightly. "And you, mademoiselle, what did you do?" Beatrice blinked rapidly, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. I don't remember. It all happened so quickly. I felt faint. I think I clutched the door frame to steady myself." Poirot's eyes flicked to her hands, still trembling. "And did you touch anything else in the study?" Her eyes widened further, a flicker of fear passing over her features. No, I don't think so." Poirot's gaze remained steady, his tone unwavering. "Think carefully, mademoiselle. A small detail, a touch, a brush of the hand. These things can reveal much." Beatrice's breathing quickened, a faint sheen of perspiration appearing on her forehead. I may have touched the edge of the desk, just for a moment. I was in shock." Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." As they turned to leave, Hastings leaned in, whispering, "Poirot, you don't really suspect her, do you?" Poirot's lips curved into a mysterious smile. "Suspect, mon ami?" "Not yet. But I do suspect that the truth is more tangled than it appears, and Beatrice, I think, has just revealed something without realizing it." Hastings frowned, struggling to piece it together. "And what, precisely, is that?" Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Why, Hastings, that even in the midst of a tragedy, the smallest slip can betray the greatest of secrets." As they left the garden, Hastings cast a concerned glance at Poirot. "You were pressing Beatrice rather hard, Poirot. Do you truly suspect her of something?" Poirot smiled faintly, his steps measured as they re-entered the manor. "Suspect Hastings? No. Not in the sense you mean, but she knows more than she admits." Her hands trembled, yes, but it was not merely grief. It was fear. "Fear of what?" "Of discovery, mon ami." She touched the desk. Perhaps it was merely, as she said, in a moment of shock. But perhaps not. They entered the drawing room, where Lady Melrose sat with Roland, the young man's face pale, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked up sharply as they entered, his jaw tightening as if bracing for an assault. Poirot paused, his sharp gaze assessing every twitch of Roland's fingers, every flicker of his eyes. "Ah, young Roland," Poirot said, his tone deceptively light. "You were close to the Colonel, were you not?" Roland hesitated, glancing at Lady Melrose, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Yes, sir. The Colonel took me under his wing. Treated me like a son, really." Poirot's moustaches twitched, his sharp eyes never leaving the young man's face. "And you were to marry Beatrice, his ward?" Roland's face flushed slightly. "Yes. The engagement was announced only a few months ago." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the implications. "And yet, I sense a certain hesitation in your manner. Forgive me, but it does not seem the attitude of a young man soon to be wed. Were there difficulties, perhaps? Roland's hands tightened further, the knuckles whitening. No, I mean, perhaps. The colonel was a strict man, difficult to please at times. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Did he oppose your engagement? Roland swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Not exactly, but he had high standards, expected me to live up to his expectations. Beatrice and I often felt, well, scrutinized. Poirot's gaze sharpened, catching the slight tremor in the young man's voice. And did this scrutiny extend to financial matters, perhaps? I understand that Beatrice stands to inherit a considerable sum. Roland's eyes flicked to Lady Melrose, who had gone very still, her face carefully expressionless. I don't know. Beatrice never mentioned it. Ah, Poirot murmured, his tone soft but pointed. A curious thing, is it not? To be on the brink of marriage and yet unaware of one's fiancé's financial position. Tell me, Roland, where were you at the precise moment the shot was fired? Roland's mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes darted to Lady Melrose, then back to Poirot. I was in the drawing room with Lady Melrose and Major Baines. We all heard the shot at the same time. Poirot's eyes remained locked on the young man's, his expression unreadable. And you rushed to the study with the others? Yes, Roland replied, his voice gaining a touch of defiance. We all did. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Merci, monsieur. You have been most helpful. As they stepped back into the hall, Hastings frowned, his brow furrowing. Poirot, what are you playing at? You're pressing them all, but you haven't told me what you're looking for. Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming. Patience, my friend. I am merely testing the waters, seeing how each ripple spreads. They moved toward the study once more, and Poirot paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes flicking over the orderly room. The desk, the bookshelves, the polished wooden floor, all meticulously maintained, reflecting the colonel's disciplined nature. And yet something felt out of place, a discordant note in the symphony of order. Poirot stepped closer to the desk, his fingers hovering over the scattered papers. His eyes fell once more on the unfinished letter, the pen left askew, the ink dry and crusted at the tip. He picked it up carefully, examining the angle at which it lay. Hastings, he said quietly, consider this. If the colonel had intended to take his own life, would he have begun a letter to his beloved wife and then stopped midway? Hastings blinked. Well, perhaps he lost his nerve. Poirot's lips tightened. No, my friend. A man like Melrose does not waver. He acts decisively or not at all. This letter, it was interrupted. Hastings frowned. But you think someone else was in the room with him? How, if the door was locked? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, that, Hastings, is the crux of the matter. Consider the wax we found on the windowsill. What if the window, though seemingly locked, was not the true means of entry? What if it was, instead, a means of signaling? Hastings looked baffled. Signaling? You mean someone signaled the colonel through the window? Poirot straightened, his eyes sharp. Precisely. The smudge of wax suggests a candle was placed here and quickly removed. A signal, perhaps, to indicate it was time to act. Hastings stared at him. But who would have done such a thing, and why? Poirot's gaze grew distant, his mind clearly working through the layers of the puzzle. That, my dear Hastings, is the question. But I suspect that if we find the one who placed that candle, we will find our answer. As they stepped back into the hallway, Poirot's sharp ears caught the faint sound of a hushed conversation from the far end of the corridor. He placed a finger to his lips, motioning for Hastings to remain silent. They moved quietly toward the sound, and as they rounded the corner, they caught a glimpse of Beatrice, her face pale and her hands clutching at the lapels of Major Baines's jacket. "You promised me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You said it would be over quickly." Baines's jaw tightened, his voice a low, harsh whisper. "Keep your nerve, girl. If you crack now, we're both finished." Poirot's eyes narrowed, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. He pulled Hastings back, retreating silently down the hall. Hastings' eyes were wide as they slipped into the empty sitting room. "Poirot, did you hear that?" Poirot's lips curved into a smile, his mustaches quivering with satisfaction. "Oh yes, Hastings, and the plot, as they say, thickens. Come, my friend, it is time we paid another visit to the study." As they slipped back into the study, Poirot's steps were light and precise, each movement a calculated part of his larger plan. Hastings, struggling to keep his composure, cast a nervous glance over his shoulder. The whispered exchange between Beatrice and Major Baines still echoed in his mind, raising more questions than it answered. Poirot paused before the desk, his fingers gently straightening the scattered papers, aligning them into a neat stack. He examined the letter once more, his eyes narrowing at the telltale interruption in the ink line. Then his gaze shifted to the polished revolver still resting beside the chalk outline where the colonel's body had fallen. "Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice low and intense, "consider what we have seen and heard. The colonel, a man of strict routine, dies in a locked room, a revolver in his hand. Yet the letter on his desk is unfinished, his pen dropped hastily, and there is that curious mark of wax upon the window-sill. And now we have heard a whispered confession of sorts, a fragment of fear between Beatrice and the Major." Hastings, still struggling to piece it all together, frowned. "But what does it mean, Poirot? If Baines and Beatrice were involved, why stage it as a suicide, and why involve the colonel at all?" Poirot's eyes sparkled, his fingers tapping lightly against his chin. "Ah, but that is the question, is it not? Why indeed? Let us consider the facts. Beatrice is the colonel's ward, his financial heir, and engaged to a young man who seems less than confident in his affections. Major Baines, an old friend of the colonel, clearly harbors some hidden motive, and they share a secret. But what, I wonder, is that secret?" Before Hastings could respond, the door creaked open and Lady Melrose entered, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She clutched a lace handkerchief, her hands trembling slightly. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice wavering. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I must speak with you. I cannot shake the feeling that something is terribly amiss." Poirot straightened, his expression softening. "Please, madame, sit. You have every right to be concerned." Lady Melrose hesitated, then sank into a nearby armchair, her fingers twisting the lace in her lap. "It is about Beatrice," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I fear she has become entangled in something beyond her understanding." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "You believe she is in danger, madame?" Lady Melrose nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, Archie, my husband. He was a strong man, a man of principle, but he had a tendency to control those around him, to bend them to his will. Beatrice, poor child, she has always been vulnerable, easily swayed by stronger personalities." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze intent. "And Major Baines, did he exert such an influence over her, do you think?" Lady Melrose hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "I do not know. He and my husband were close, yes, but in recent months I sensed a strain between them. They often spoke in hushed tones, their conversations cutting off abruptly whenever I entered the room." Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And did the colonel confide in you, madame? Did he express any particular concerns regarding Beatrice or Major Baines?" Lady Melrose bit her lip, her gaze dropping to her clenched hands. "No, but there was one thing. A few nights ago, I overheard a fragment of a conversation. My husband was speaking to Baines in his study. He said something about a debt to be repaid and that no one must know." Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, now we approach the heart of the matter. A debt, you say? Financial, perhaps, or something more insidious. Lady Melrose's fingers tightened on the handkerchief, the lace crumpling beneath her grip. I do not know, monsieur, but I fear that whatever it was, it led to his death. Poirot rose, his posture suddenly sharp, his eyes blazing with intensity. Merci, madame. You have been most helpful. I ask only that you remain strong a little while longer. The truth, I promise you, will soon come to light. Lady Melrose managed a weak, trembling smile before rising unsteadily to her feet and slipping from the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, Hastings released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Poirot, what does this mean? A debt? Could the colonel have been blackmailed? Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. Perhaps, mon ami, or perhaps it is something even darker. Consider the facts. The colonel, a man of strict honor, a soldier known for his unbending principles, confronted with a secret so damning that he felt compelled to confront his oldest friend. And yet, he died not in open conflict, but in a manner designed to appear as suicide. Hastings' eyes widened. You mean it was staged? Poirot's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. Ah, Hastings, you begin to see. Yes, I believe it was staged, but not for the reasons one might expect. There is a deeper game at play here, a twist of the knife designed to cut both ways. He straightened, his expression growing suddenly fierce. Come, Hastings. It is time we confront Major Baines. I suspect the truth lies not in what has been said, but in what has been carefully left unsaid. They strode from the study, their footsteps sharp and purposeful against the polished floors. Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities, each detail clicking into place as he prepared for the next crucial step in his investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, but the picture they formed remained maddeningly incomplete. And as they approached the drawing room, Poirot's sharp ears caught the faint strains of a whispered conversation, the low rumble of Baines' voice cutting through the quiet. Poirot paused, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. Ah, mon ami, the moment of revelation approaches. Let us not keep our suspect waiting. As they approached the drawing room, Poirot motioned for Hastings to slow his steps, his head tilting slightly as he strained to catch the low, urgent voices within. The door was ajar, a sliver of light cutting across the polished floor, and through it drifted the unmistakable timbre of Major Baines, his tone harsh and clipped. You don't understand, Baines was saying, his words edged with a barely restrained fury. If this gets out, we're both finished. Do you hear me? Finished! A softer voice responded, its tremor betraying a mix of fear and desperation. It was Beatrice, her usual fragile tone now tinged with an edge of defiance. I never wanted this. You said it would be simple. You said no one would get hurt. Poirot's eyes gleamed as he exchanged a quick glance with Hastings. He pressed a finger to his lips, then moved silently closer to the door, his head tilted to catch every word. Simple? Baines hissed. You think this is simple? The old man was too close, far too close. We had no choice. But the letter, Beatrice whispered, her voice breaking slightly. What if they find it? What if they discover the truth? There was a sharp intake of breath, a rustle of fabric, and the distinct sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor. Calm yourself, Baines snapped. Poirot is a clever devil, but he cannot prove what he cannot see. We have covered our tracks, and no one will believe you capable of such a thing. Poirot straightened, his mustaches twitching with satisfaction. He had heard enough. With a quick, decisive movement, he pushed open the door, stepping into the drawing room with Hastings at his side. Baines and Beatrice froze, their faces draining of color as they turned to face the intruders. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth, its orange glow casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Ah, Major Baines. Mademoiselle Beatrice. Poirot said smoothly, his voice as sharp as the glint in his eyes. "I hope we are not interrupting." Beatrice's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, while Baines took a half-step back, his jaw tightening. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, struggling to regain his composure, "what is the meaning of this?" Poirot took another step into the room, his gaze never leaving their faces. "The meaning, Major? It is quite simple. I've been conducting an investigation, you see, and it appears that I have stumbled upon a most interesting conversation." Beatrice's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and she sank into the nearest armchair, her eyes filling with tears. Baines, however, straightened, his soldier's discipline reasserting itself. "I don't know what you think you've heard," he said coldly, "but I assure you it is nothing of consequence." Poirot's smile widened, his eyes narrowing with a predatory glint. "Nothing of consequence? Perhaps. But I wonder, Major, would you say the same if I told you that I have found the key to this entire mystery?" Baines's face tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "What are you talking about?" Poirot moved closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the polished wood. "The wax on the windowsill, Major. A curious thing, no? A mark left in haste, a small detail that most would overlook, but which reveals much to those who observe carefully." Baines's eyes flicked involuntarily to the window, his composure slipping for the briefest of moments. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice strained. Poirot's eyes sparkled, his tone turning almost playful. "Ah, but you do, Major. You see, the wax tells a story. A candle placed upon the sill, quickly removed, a signal sent in the dead of night, a meeting arranged, perhaps, or a signal to a waiting accomplice." Beatrice let out a soft, strangled sob, her head falling into her hands. Baines's face flushed a deep, furious red, his eyes hardening into cold, sharp points. "Enough of this," he snapped. "You have no proof. You are grasping at shadows, Poirot." Poirot's smile grew even sharper, his eyes gleaming like a cat toying with a cornered mouse. "Shadows, Major? I think not. I have spoken with Lady Melrose. She has told me of a debt, a dark secret known only to a few. And then there is the unfinished letter, the one the Colonel began just before his death. To my beloved Constance I must confess." "Confess what, Major? What was it that the Colonel knew, that he sought to reveal before his untimely end?" Baines's fists trembled, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Beatrice let out another choked sob, her hands shaking as she gripped the arms of the chair. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice broken. "Please stop." Poirot's gaze shifted to her, his expression softening slightly. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "it is not too late to tell the truth. Whatever part you played, whatever fears you harbor, they will only grow worse in the shadows." Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes wide and desperate. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking, but then Baines stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. "That's enough," he growled. "You have no proof, Poirot, no evidence. You think you can intimidate us with your insinuations, but you are wrong." Poirot's eyes never left the Major's, his smile now a thin, razor-sharp line. "Am I, Major? We shall see. But remember this. Murder, like any other crime, leaves traces, and those who think themselves clever enough to erase them often overlook the smallest, most telling details." With a final, piercing glance at Baines, Poirot turned sharply on his heel, gesturing for Hastings to follow. As they stepped into the hall, Hastings released a long, shaky breath, his heart still racing from the confrontation. "Poirot," he whispered, "what just happened in there?" Poirot smiled, his moustaches twitching with satisfaction. "Patience, mon ami. The trap is set, and now we must only wait for our quarry to stumble into it." As they moved away from the drawing-room, Hastings struggled to match Poirot's brisk pace. The little Belgian's eyes sparkled with a fierce, unrelenting intensity, his mind clearly racing through the threads of the case. Hastings, still trying to piece together the fragments of conversation they had overheard, finally broke the silence. "Poirot, what exactly are you thinking? You seem more certain now, but you haven't explained what you suspect. Are Baines and Beatrice truly involved?" Poirot slowed his steps, his hands clasped behind his back as they reached the grand staircase. He paused, his gaze flicking up to the chandelier that cast shifting patterns of light and shadow across the polished floor. "Oui, Hastings," he said softly. "I believe they are involved, but the nature of that involvement remains unclear. It is like a painting seen in fragments, each piece revealing something new, yet the full picture remains obscured." Hastings frowned, struggling to follow Poirot's metaphor. But the letter, the wax on the windowsill, the whispered conversations, what do they all mean? Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind clearly assembling the puzzle even as he spoke. "The letter, mon ami, is the key. The colonel was about to reveal something, a confession, perhaps, or a warning. But he was interrupted. The wax on the windowsill suggests a signal, a prearranged sign between conspirators. And as for the whispered conversation we just overheard, it confirms that Beatrice and Baines share a dark secret, one that has driven them to the brink of panic." Hastings' eyes widened. "You think they killed the colonel, then? That they staged his death as a suicide to cover their tracks?" Poirot's lips tightened. "It is possible, but there are still gaps in the narrative. Consider, Hastings, the nature of the colonel himself. A man of strict honor, a soldier whose life was defined by discipline and order. Such a man would not easily fall prey to blackmail or deceit. No, if the colonel was drawn into this web, it must have been by something truly devastating." Hastings fell silent, his mind struggling to catch up with Poirot's rapid deductions as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Poirot paused, his head tilting slightly as he caught the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to the study creaked open, and Inspector Japp stepped out, his usually confident expression tinged with uncertainty. He spotted Poirot and Hastings, his eyebrows lifting in mild surprise. "Ah, Poirot," he said, straightening his coat as he approached. "I've just had a look around the study, still trying to piece this one together." Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming with a sharp, knowing light. "And what have you found, my friend?" Japp hesitated, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Not much, I'm afraid. The door was locked from the inside, the window latch secured, and the revolver found beside the body shows no sign of tampering. It all points to a straightforward suicide." Poirot's mustaches twitched with barely contained amusement. "Ah, but that is precisely the problem, is it not? It all seems too perfect, too carefully arranged." Japp frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at, Poirot? Are you suggesting this wasn't a suicide?" Poirot stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Consider the scene, my friend. The desk carefully arranged, the unfinished letter abandoned mid-sentence. The wax on the windowsill, a silent testament to a hurried meeting or a prearranged signal. And then there is the colonel himself. A man of rigid principles, a soldier to the core. Would such a man, driven by honor and duty, end his own life without leaving a clear and decisive message?" Japp's frown deepened, his fingers drumming against his leg as he considered Poirot's words. "You're saying it was staged? That someone made it look like a suicide to cover their tracks?" Poirot's eyes gleamed, his satisfaction growing as he saw Japp beginning to grasp the threads of his theory. "Oui, mon ami. I believe the colonel was murdered, and that his death was made to look like a suicide to hide a darker truth." Japp exhaled sharply, his face hardening as the implications sank in. "But why? And by whom?" Poirot's gaze drifted to the far end of the hall, where Beatrice's pale figure flitted past like a ghost, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. "That, my dear Japp, is the question. But I believe that if we uncover the true nature of the debt the colonel sought to confess in his final letter, we shall find our answer." Before Japp could respond, a sharp cry echoed from the direction of the drawing room. Poirot's head snapped up, his sharp eyes narrowing as the sound of hurried footsteps reached them. A moment later, Lady Melrose stumbled into view, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "Inspector Japp, Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, clutching at the door frame for support. "You must come quickly. There's been another death." Poirot's eyes flashed with a fierce, burning intensity as he stepped forward, his mind racing to connect this latest piece of the puzzle. He placed a reassuring hand on Lady Melrose's trembling shoulder. "Steady yourself, madame," he said gently, his voice firm but soothing. "Tell us what has happened." Lady Melrose's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she clutched at her chest. "It's Major Baines. He's dead." For a brief moment, the world seemed to hang, suspended, the air thick with the weight of her words. Poirot's eyes flicked to Japp, whose face had gone deathly pale. "Quickly, Hastings," Poirot snapped, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "To the drawing room at once." They rushed down the corridor, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors as they approached the open doorway. Within, the fire still crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. And there, slumped in an armchair, his head tilted at a grotesque angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, sat Major Baines. Poirot paused at the threshold, his sharp eyes sweeping over the scene, noting the overturned table, the shattered glass, and the telltale smear of blood on the edge of the fireplace. His lips pressed into a thin line, his mind already racing ahead to the implications of this second, unexpected death. "Hastings," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "The game has changed, and the stakes, I fear, have just become much higher." Poirot stepped into the drawing room, his sharp eyes flicking over the scene with the precision of a surgeon. Major Baines' body slumped awkwardly in the armchair, his head lolled to one side, his lifeless eyes fixed on some distant point above the fireplace. The faint, metallic scent of blood hung in the air, mingling with the fading aroma of wood smoke and the sharp tang of spilled brandy. Hastings, stumbling in behind Poirot, froze at the sight, his breath catching in his throat. "Good Lord," he whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. "Baines! But how? He was alive not 5 minutes ago." Poirot moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, his gaze sweeping over every detail of the scene. The overturned side table, the shattered glass, the dark stains spreading across the embroidered rug beneath Baines's chair, each element told its own small, silent story. He paused beside the armchair, his head tilting slightly as he noted the angle of the Major's head, the unnatural twist of his torso, the slight froth of blood at the corner of his mouth. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, his voice low and intense. This was no simple attack. It was swift, precise, perhaps even planned. Inspector Japp arrived a moment later, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What the devil is this, Poirot?" he growled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "First the Colonel, now Baines? What sort of madman have we got on our hands?" Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable, his sharp eyes never leaving the body in the chair. "Calm yourself, Japp," he said quietly. "This is no act of madness. It is a calculated strike, one piece in a far more intricate puzzle." Japp let out a frustrated huff, his gaze sweeping over the disordered room. But who? And why? What possible motive could someone have for killing Baines? Poirot's lips tightened, his mind racing through the fragments of conversation he had overheard, the whispered fears, the half-hidden glances. He reached down, his gloved hand gently tilting Baines's head, his keen eyes noting the faint, bruised line encircling the Major's throat. "Strangled," he murmured, his voice tinged with a grim satisfaction. "And swiftly, from behind. See the bruising? The way the flesh has been compressed? This was no impromptu struggle, Japp. Our killer struck with precision and purpose. Jap's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he took a step closer, his eyes darkening as he caught sight of the twisted necktie still clutched in Bain's limp hand. "Good grief," he muttered, his voice a low growl. The man didn't even have time to defend himself. Poirot rose to his full height, his gaze shifting to the shattered glass on the floor, the thin trail of liquid snaking its way across the carpet toward the fireplace. He moved closer, his sharp eyes catching the faint, reddish smear along the edge of the hearth. "Hastings," he said suddenly, his voice sharp and commanding. "Fetch me a candle, if you please. Quickly." Hastings, still pale and shaken, hesitated for a moment before nodding stiffly and hurrying from the room. Jap shot Poirot a puzzled glance. "A candle? What on earth for, Poirot?" Poirot's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Patience, my friend. You shall see." A moment later, Hastings returned, a half-burned candle clutched in his trembling hand. Poirot took it without a word, carefully tilting it to examine the base, his eyes narrowing as he noted the faint residue of red wax clinging to the bottom. He straightened, his eyes blazing with sudden understanding. "Ah," he whispered, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Just as I suspected." He crossed to the window, his gloved fingers gently tracing the faint, greasy smear of wax still clinging to the sill. He bent closer, his eyes narrowing as he caught the faint, unmistakable impression of a fingerprint in the dried wax. Jap, his patience clearly wearing thin, stepped closer, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is it, Poirot? What have you found?" Poirot straightened, his gaze flicking back to the lifeless form of Major Baines. "A clue, my dear Jap. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, but one that speaks volumes. Our killer, in their haste to complete their grisly work, has left behind a most telling trace." Jap's eyes narrowed, his mind clearly struggling to keep pace with Poirot's rapid deductions. "A fingerprint? But what does it mean?" Poirot's smile grew sharper, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "It means, my friend, that our killer is not as clever as they believe themselves to be. They have made a critical error, one that shall soon prove their undoing." He straightened, his sharp eyes scanning the room once more, his mind already racing ahead to the next critical step in his investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, the shadows retreating as the truth slowly emerged from the darkness. "Come, Jap," he said suddenly, his voice filled with a fierce, unrelenting energy. "The time has come to draw the net tight. Our killer, I think, has grown too bold, too confident. It is time they were reminded of the dangers of underestimating Hercule Poirot." Without another word, he strode from the room, his steps sharp and purposeful, his mind already leaping ahead to the final confrontation he knew was fast approaching. Hastings and Jap exchanged a brief, bewildered glance before hurrying after him, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors as they followed the small, determined figure of their brilliant companion into the gathering storm. The great hall of Melrose Manor had taken on a new, oppressive stillness as Poirot, Hastings, and Jap made their way back through its shadowed corridors. The echo of their footsteps rang sharply off the cold marble floors, each step a harsh reminder of the violent death they had just witnessed. Poirot moved with a quiet, controlled intensity, his sharp eyes flicking over every detail, every corner, as if searching for the final, missing piece of his mental puzzle. Jap, still flushed with the shock of Baines's murder, shot Poirot a sidelong glance, his jaw tightening as he struggled to keep pace with the little Belgian. "All right, Poirot," he said, his voice a low, urgent growl. "No more games. What's going on? First the Colonel, now Baines. What in blazes is happening here?" Poirot did not slow his steps, his gaze fixed on the far end of the hall, where a shaft of pale afternoon light spilled in through a stained glass window, casting fractured patterns across the floor. "Patience, mon ami," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with a hard edge. All shall be revealed in time, but first we must gather our suspects. Japp's face darkened, his brow furrowing in confusion. Gather our suspects? You mean to confront them all together? Poirot smiled, his mustaches twitching with satisfaction. Precisely. The time has come to lay all the cards upon the table, to strip away the shadows and expose the truth. For I have seen the pattern, my friend, and it is a most intricate, most fascinating design. Hastings, trailing a step behind, felt a familiar thrill rise in his chest at Poirot's words. He had seen this transformation before, the sudden, electrifying certainty that seized his friend when a case reached its final, critical stage. And yet, as he followed Poirot into the smaller, more intimate confines of the library, he could not shake the sense of impending danger that clung to the air, the feeling that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Poirot paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on the polished brass handle as he turned to face Japp. "Send for the others, if you please. I wish to speak with Lady Melrose, Miss Beatrice, Mr. Forster, and Dr. Cartwright. It is time, I think, to draw the curtain on this little drama." Japp hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching Poirot's face for any hint of hesitation, but finding only a calm, unshakable resolve. With a final, muttered curse, he turned and strode away, his footsteps echoing sharply down the hall. Poirot entered the library, his sharp eyes quickly taking in the familiar rows of leather-bound volumes, the heavy drapes pulled tightly against the late afternoon sun, the faint, lingering aroma of pipe smoke that clung to the air like a ghost. He crossed to the great mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room, his gloved hand trailing lightly across its polished surface as he reached for the small brass bell that sat beside a stack of neatly arranged correspondence. A few moments later, the door creaked open and Lady Melrose entered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. She was followed closely by Beatrice, her face pale and drawn, her hands twisting nervously in the folds of her skirts. Forster came next, his sharp, hawk-like eyes darting around the room as if searching for hidden threats, while Dr. Cartwright brought up the rear, his usually calm, confident expression marred by a deep, troubled frown. Poirot waited for them to take their seats, his eyes flicking over each of them in turn, noting the slight tremor in Beatrice's hands, the rigid set of Forster's jaw, the nervous, sidelong glances exchanged between the doctor and Lady Melrose. When the room had settled into an uneasy silence, he took a slow, measured breath, his hands clasped lightly behind his back as he addressed the assembled group. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable note of authority, "I have asked you here today because I believe we stand upon the threshold of the truth. 2 men lie dead, Colonel Arkwright, the master of this house, and Major Baines, his trusted second. Both deaths, at first glance, appear to be the result of tragic accidents or desperate suicides, and yet I tell you now that this is not the case." A sharp, collective intake of breath rippled through the room, Beatrice's eyes widening in panic as she clutched at the armrest of her chair. Forster's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line, while Dr. Cartwright's hand twitched slightly at his side, his fingers curling into a tight fist. Poirot's eyes never left their faces, his sharp gaze sweeping over each of them in turn as he continued, "No, my friends, these were not accidents, nor were they the result of despair. They were murders, carefully planned and skillfully executed, each piece of the puzzle fitting together with the precision of a master craftsman." Lady Melrose let out a soft, choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she shook her head in disbelief. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and outrage, "surely you cannot mean—" Poirot's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "Oh, but I do, madame. I've seen the threads of this conspiracy, the small, seemingly disconnected details that bind it together, and I tell you now that the truth is both simpler and more terrible than you can imagine." He paused, his eyes flicking to Beatrice, who had begun to tremble visibly, her pale hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the polished surface of the desk before her. "I have discovered, for example, the significance of the wax on the windowsill, the half-written letter, the whispered conversations overheard in the darkened halls of this great house. I have seen the fear in your eyes, Miss Beatrice, the guilt that gnaws at your soul. And I have heard the desperate, half-muttered confessions of a man driven to the edge of madness by a secret too terrible to keep." Forster's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, fierce intensity as he leaned forward in his chair, his sharp, predatory gaze fixed on Poirot's calm, unflinching face. "What are you saying, Poirot?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "If you have something to accuse us of, then out with it. Enough of these games." Poirot's eyes sparkled with a fierce, unrelenting fire as he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands still clasped tightly behind his back, his voice dropping to a low, ominous whisper. "Oh, I shall, monsieur," he said, his tone sharp as a blade. "I shall reveal all, and then, my friends, we shall see who among you has the courage to face the terrible truth." A taut silence held the room in its grip, the kind of silence that prickled at the skin and made every creak of the house sound like a cannon shot. Poirot stood immobile at the center of the room, his polished shoes planted precisely in line with the fireplace hearth, his hands still, linked neatly behind his back. The suspects, Lady Melrose, Beatrice, Forster, and Dr. Cartwright, sat like statues, suspended in unease. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally began to manifest in a distant rumble of thunder. Hastings, seated just beside the desk, shifted slightly in his chair. He had seen Poirot work through many cases, but this had the coiled tension of a spring about to snap. Poirot drew a breath, long and measured, before speaking again. "Let us begin where all truths hide, in motive. Colonel Arkwright was not a universally beloved man. No, he was admired, perhaps feared, but in his personal dealings he could be cruel, cold, unforgiving." He turned slightly toward Lady Melrose, his voice now directed with a subtle intimacy. "Madame, your husband did not merely rule this house. He ruled your life. You bore it with strength, yes, but also in silence. And silence, as I have found, often carries a terrible weight." Lady Melrose stared at him, stricken but unmoving. Her lip trembled faintly. Poirot went on. "Dr. Cartwright, you are a man of medicine, of logic, and yet you too harbored secrets. There were discrepancies in the Colonel's medical charts. Inconsistencies subtle enough to escape notice, unless one looks closely. You wrote prescriptions he did not need, sedatives administered under the guise of treating insomnia." Cartwright's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "But no, it is not you, Doctor, who played the final hand," Poirot said, pivoting toward the other side of the room. "Mr. Forster, military man, loyal second, but even a soldier has his limits." Forster gave a harsh little laugh, cold and brittle. "You think I killed him? You're out of your depth, Poirot." "No, monsieur. I'm very much within the shallow end of your deception. You were once disciplined by Colonel Arkwright, disgraced during your service. But what the Colonel did not know was that Lady Melrose herself intervened to protect your name. She convinced him to suppress the official report. You owed her your reputation." Beatrice sat up sharply at that. Her eyes flicked to her mother in disbelief, but Poirot raised one finger delicately. And yet, Forster's guilt was not the fuel for murder. It was your protection of someone else entirely. His gaze landed squarely on Beatrice. She recoiled slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "No. Oui, mademoiselle. You were the axis upon which this entire affair turned. You were the one thing the Colonel could not control. Your affection, your desires, your independence, these things he could not bend to his will. Lady Melrose exhaled sharply, a sound that was almost a sob. Poirot stepped forward, quiet as a cat. "You planned to run away, did you not? With Major Baines. He was the only man your father had not already cowed or dismissed, and you loved him or believed you did. But Colonel Arkwright found out. The letter you attempted to destroy, it was never burned fully. I retrieved what remained from the fireplace grate, a declaration of intent. You meant to elope." Beatrice's hands went to her mouth. He wasn't supposed to find out. But he did. And when he confronted Baines, the Major did what so many cowards have done before. He saved himself. He agreed to leave, but not before confiding in someone. Here Poirot turned back to Lady Melrose. "Your daughter came to you in desperation, and you, Madame, you took action, but you did not kill your husband with a gun or a knife. You did it with silence. You withheld his medication. You let the tension rise, and it was Forster who finally tipped it over the edge." Forster stood suddenly, fists clenched. "No, he attacked her. He had his cane raised. I only meant to stop him." Poirot raised a hand. "Yes, you struck out. A blow not meant to kill, but it did. The fall, the fracture. The truth is, Colonel Arkwright did not die immediately. Dr. Cartwright, he found him in time. But he saw his opportunity. He administered a lethal dose of the sedative. A quiet euthanasia." Gasps sounded all around. Cartwright sank into his chair, eyes glassy. He was already slipping. "I thought, if I ended it quickly, no one would have to suffer through a scandal. I thought I was protecting them." "And Major Baines?" Japp asked, stepping forward, his voice tight. Poirot's face darkened slightly. Baines was blackmailing Beatrice after the Colonel's death. He never intended to marry her. He had no real affection for her, only leverage. He knew Forster had struck the blow. He knew about Cartwright, and when he threatened to expose everything, one of you acted to silence him. His eyes fell on Beatrice. "No," she said, almost inaudibly. "No, I didn't." Poirot nodded gently. "Non, mademoiselle. It was your mother." Lady Melrose stood, trembling, her face ghost pale. He was going to ruin her life. I didn't know how else to protect her. Poirot's voice softened. "You lured him to the conservatory. You told him you would pay, but instead you poisoned the brandy." The silence that followed was like a death knell. No one moved. The storm outside cracked across the heavens, and then the world fell still again. Lady Melrose sat slowly, her eyes hollow, empty. "I only wanted peace. For her. For all of us." Poirot looked at Japp, who stepped forward with practiced steadiness. "I'll see to it," he said gruffly. "We'll take them all in." But Poirot held up a hand. "One moment, if you please." He turned to Hastings and smiled faintly. "My friend, there is always more behind the curtain than first appears. This case, it has reminded me that even in the grandest of houses, the smallest of fears can twist into the darkest of crimes." Japp looked grim. "Well, if you ask me, Poirot, there's more guilt to go around here than we can carry in handcuffs." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "But the law must deal in actions, not intentions. That, my dear Japp, is both its power and its tragedy." He straightened his cuffs with a fastidious touch and turned for the door. Hastings, after a long pause, followed. "Where to now, Poirot?" Poirot glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "To dinner, mon ami. I find that murder always sharpens the appetite." He paused at the doorway and added softly, "But let us hope the soup is less complicated."